Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today for a new session of the GASI webinar series. The GASI webinar series serves as a platform for the GASI network members to share experience and expertise in evidence synthesis and to learn about potential collaboration. So before I begin, and if you are using the GoToWebinar for the first time, as you might have noticed, you are automatically muted. So if you would like to submit any comments or questions, you can do it through using the question panels on the right. You can type in your question or comment, or you can press the raise your hand button and we can unmute you for verbal questions and you can directly direct your question to the presenter. Today's session is about engaging environmental policymakers with systematic reviews. What are the challenges, solutions, and lessons learned? And our presenter today is Dr. Nicola Randall. She manages the Center for Evidence-Based Agriculture and Harper Adams University, and currently she leads the UK Center of the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence. Her work centers around evidence synthesis and its use in underpinning agricultural and land policy and management, and integration of evidence in decision making. Thank you, Dr. Nicola, for joining us today.
Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us, everybody else as well. As said, I'll be talking about engaging environmental policymakers with systematic reviews today, and talking about some of the challenges we've encountered, together with some solutions and lessons learned. And there we go. Sorry, my slides are messing about. Okay, so before I start, I just thought I'd show you where I'm from. So I'm based in the UK at Harper Adams University. So you should be able to see on the slides there where that is. And I actually work in the Centre for Evidence-Based Agriculture, which is a specialist evidence synthesis centre, particularly around agri-food, which involves a lot of land management and environmental evidence as well. And yeah, we are part of the UK Centre for the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence, which some of you may have come across. Okay, so why is this important then, to think about engaging policymakers with systematic reviews? Well, in order for evidence syntheses to be valuable to policy decisions, we really need to work with policy to ensure a number of things. A common understanding is probably one of the key ones, to think about the purpose of evidence syntheses and to make sure that reviews are relevant in context and communicated appropriately. And so, as I said, this presentation will introduce some of those challenges and look at ways in which we can work together to ensure that evidence syntheses are valuable for policy making. And what I'm going to do is talk about a published paper which forms the basis of this this talk, but also talk a little bit about some of my personal experience and really focus on one particular case study. So this is the paper that forms the basis of this review. So you can see the link at the top there. I worked with two other people, Alexandra Collins and Deborah Coughlin. And between the three of us, we've got quite a good knowledge of working on evidence synthesis within policy. So Alex was working, she's a researcher, but has had a knowledge exchange fellowship, working specifically on the use of research and evidence in integrated management. She was particularly focused on water research, working with the UK Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, which is a government department, and the Environment Agency, which is a government agency to that department. And then Debbie Coughlin was working within Defra as a knowledge broker. So she really liaised with researchers carrying out evidence syntheses for the policy organisation and worked a lot on making sure that we had a common understanding and could work together, both knowing what we wanted. And as said, I work in a centre that's specifically for evidence synthesis, and I've worked on various evidence syntheses projects. So within the UK for Defra and the Environment Agency, along with Debbie and Alex, but also on other EU projects and wider global organisations as well that link to global policy. So it might be useful to just look at the policy cycle initially, because if you've got an understanding of what policy needs are, then it makes it easier to think about how evidence synthesis might be incorporated. So if we start at the top of this cycle, policymakers need to think about what the issue is that they're working on. You know, what do they need to know? And to do that, they have to understand the situation, then look at different options that might be available to them. And once they've done that, they can think about delivering those options. How do they prepare for that? What responsibilities do they have, and how will they commit to them? And then how do they implement those actions, whatever they might be, and monitor them to make sure whether they're working or not. And that may then need some evaluation, which takes you back to the top again and defining the issue and so on. So one of the things we did was we put on, we looked at how evidence syntheses such as systematic reviews can fit within that policy cycle. And these are some of the ways in which that can happen. So an evidence synthesis can first of all scope what's been researched on a topic to help defining issues. It can identify interactions that help define that issue and to understand the situation. You can also use evidence syntheses to look at different options. So for example, what interventions might work or not, in which case you can then help the policymaker develop and appraise those options and evaluate the evidence on different outcomes. You can also look at benefits and risks of different interventions, and working all the way around the circle, provide an evidence base in order for the policymaker to decide on their responsibilities. And of course, the good thing about systematic reviews and similar evidence syntheses is that they're also transparent, so that you can see where that evidence has come from before you're implementing any decisions. So, so I just thought that might be a bit of useful background context. So if we go back to our question then, of how best to integrate evidence syntheses into policy making, we've got a number of challenges that we've identified listed here. So time and cost are big challenges. Question setting, what do we do around the question? How do we decide what a question is? Do we actually understand each other? What sort of evidence might we find? How much of it might there be or not be? How do we communicate findings, and how do we communicate with our policy organisations when we're working with them? And how are reviews actually used in policy decisions? Are they used? So if we start at the beginning then, so the first issue really is time and cost. Systematic reviews are expensive and time consuming. It's very common for a review to take at least 12 months, sometimes double that to complete. That can cause problems as far as time goes. If a policy decision's got to be made, do policymakers really want to wait that long? Often decisions are made in response to, you know, to things that are happening at that period. But also the cost. You could be looking at quite extensive costs for a systematic review. If you think you've got maybe 1 or 2 people working full-time on that, as well as a number of experts and stakeholders that you might have to give funding or payment to as well, that can be quite an expensive process. And of course, many policymakers are under pressure to save money. So it's quite important that policymakers understand the benefits of systematic reviews. Yes, they can be expensive, and yes, they can be time consuming, but that money is well spent if it saves time and money on perhaps carrying out primary research that isn't needed because the evidence is already there. The difference between a systematic review and perhaps a faster, cheaper traditional review is, of course, its rigour and its comprehensiveness. And that can be really important when decisions are of high consequence or subject to high profile or in-depth scrutiny, such as for topics that might be controversial, for example. Of course, sometimes actually you don't have the time. Sometimes there may be a decision that needs to be made very rapidly, and a traditional systematic review isn't feasible. And what needs to happen there is that you take a risk-based approach. Actually, what are the trade-offs? If we took a year, is there going to be more of a problem than if we did something more quickly, but that's less robust? But if that's the case, we can still try to minimise issues. So Defra, for example, created their own guidance on rapid evidence assessment and quick scoping reviews. So these are faster methods, but they're based on robust systematic review methodology to carry out evidence syntheses. But you have to be very clear which parts of a traditional review you might cut corners on, as it were, and what the implications of that might be. You wouldn't want to do that on a high consequence decision, but you may need to do it on where a decision is needed very rapidly. Okay, so the next potential issue is in the question setting, and this has a number of different issues surrounding it, but often it's the formatting of the question. A question that's formatted for a systematic review is often formatted in a very specific way, and that might not be suitable for the policy question that's being addressed, in which case you need to ask yourself, actually, is a systematic review the most appropriate tool? Or it might just be that the question needs formulating in a different way. And likewise, often a policy question isn't formulated in a way which is suitable for synthesis. It might be very broad, it might be vague, it might be a leading question, which immediately has the potential to lead to bias before you've even started. So it's really important that when you're working with policymakers, as with any stakeholders really, that you work together on the question setting. What different parts of your question do you have? What do you really want to know? And what's underpinning that question? It also might be that you might need to think about the type of synthesis that's being carried out. Often policy questions that we've come across in our work are very broad, and they're not really suitable for systematic reviews, but they may be suitable for systematic maps, for example. So this is a nice example of a systematic review that we carried out some years ago now for Defra. And it was a call that Defra had put out for people to tender to for a systematic review question to investigate the effectiveness of 5 different on-farm mitigations for delivering an improved water environment. And in actual fact, they not only had 5 different mitigations, but they also had 5 different outcomes that they wanted to look at. So, for example, they wanted to look at the impact of buffer strips, of woodland creation, of slurry storage, and various other things on outcomes such as nitrate pollution, phosphate pollution, sediment pollution, etc. So actually, that could really have been 25 different systematic reviews. So we worked with the government department on that, and we redefined the question as a systematic map, which of course meant that we couldn't necessarily say how effective each of those things were, because we weren't able to drill down in detail, but we were able to provide them with background information that would enable them to inform those questions. And this understanding can also be an issue. So do you really know that you've got a common understanding? And I would say out of everything, I think this is key, because this actually underpins all the other problems, really. Do you really understand what the requirements are of your, if you're a researcher carrying out a systematic review of what your policymakers are asking? Do you know how they're different from academic requirements? Doesn't mean that you do things differently, but it might mean that you need to explain constraints, perhaps. It might mean that you need to think about how you're presenting what you do, etc. Is it really feasible? And this is probably quite an important one, because what we often find with people that aren't familiar with systematic reviews, they might ask lots of different things that really aren't feasible within time or budget if you really want to follow that that robust, comprehensive methodology. Is there room for negotiation? Usually there is. Talk to the people you're working with. And terminology. Is the terminology common? It's really important to confirm the questions and all the elements of it. And again, I've got a nice example from that same review that we carried out as a systematic map. So one of the sub-questions for that was asking about the effectiveness of slurry storage for improving water quality. And as it happened, the sub-questions had been set by different people, and the person who'd set this sub-question wasn't in the room when we had our initial kick-off meeting, when we spoke to the funder initially and broke down the question. So we interpreted that about the effectiveness of slurry stores. In other words, do they leak? Do the pollutants, so some of the pollutants, for example, we're looking at biological indicators, do they reduce over time? And that wasn't picked up at the beginning, that was what our understanding was. So we carried out the whole review looking at the effectiveness of slurry stores. When we actually presented our results at the end, and bearing in mind we'd spoken to people all the way through, somebody came back and said, oh dear, it's something you never want to hear when you get to the end of a review that's taken you 12 months to do. Actually, what we meant was, what are the implications of changing the timing of slurry application onto fields? So we'd investigated something completely different than what was asked, or what they understood we were going to do. Okay. So this common understanding is really important, and one way to help with this, and something that we would nearly always do now when we work with policy organisations, is to develop a conceptual model to ensure that we've got a shared understanding. So the diagram here, I don't know how well that's come out actually, but this is a diagram, a conceptual model in a diagrammatic form that really it's for a slightly different review than the one I've talked about before. It's looking at water pollution from pesticides used in amenity sources. And what we did, we created a diagram in collaboration with Defra on the water pollution sources, the pathways and the receptors, so that we could see that we all had an understanding of where the question had come from and what was really wanted out of that question. And doing something like that can be really useful. The other thing is communicate throughout, and that works both ways. There's no point as a reviewer you sending things if people at the other end aren't reading it, and if you come into problems, don't just carry on. Make sure you communicate the whole way through. So we would normally have maybe just send an update every couple of weeks if everything's going fine, but we get straight on the phone if there's a problem, so we can talk it through, or if we think there might be a potential problem or issue. Okay, so coming on to the type of evidence that you might find now, and this can be a real issue. Again, it's partly down to expectations and common understanding, but the evidence often isn't what the policy people are expecting or really need sometimes. It might be that there's just too much and you can't look at that detail. So you might need to, if you know there's going to be too much evidence in order for you to answer a question, you might need to refocus the question, or you might need to think about doing a different type of review. It might be that there's not enough evidence to support the policy or to be able to inform policy. Policymakers often need other information other than effectiveness information. It's not just does X work on Y, on outcome Y, for example. It might be how much does it cost? So, but that's a different question again. So that sort of information could be incorporated, but it means it's a different type of question. If you're looking at existing research, you need to be looking at studies on cost, not studies on effectiveness, for example. And of course, you might find evidence that actually is quite controversial or doesn't support existing policies. So again, communication's really important here. These sort of issues need to be discussed at the beginning, the sort of issues that you might come up with, and you need to discuss how you'll deal with them at the beginning. What will you do if there's too much evidence? It might be communication, or you might have a backup plan. Hopefully you'll have carried out a scoping review, so you'll have an idea. Involve stakeholders throughout. And if you're thinking about, if you know that the evidence might be controversial, you perhaps want to think about gathering evidence from quite a broad base. So, for example, let's just suppose we were looking at something like impacts of neonicotinoid pesticides. We might be wanting to look at agricultural journals, but we also might be wanting to look at toxicology ones. We might be wanting to look at environmental ones. There might be situations where you might be needing to look at medical journals as well as agricultural or environmental journals, for example, if it's something to do with environmental health. And likewise, the type of stakeholders that you involve. Have they got a broad base? So this is just an example from that same review. One of the sub-questions was regarding woodland creation, and that again came from an agency of the UK government. But what we found was actually there was very, very little evidence specifically regarding woodland creation. And really that makes sense, you know. Woodlands take a long time to grow. If you're going to want something evidence-wise, you might need to wait until they're fully grown, which could mean waiting 12 years. It's quite difficult in that sort of timescale to have a before and an after experiment, for example. So that was fairly unpopular, that part of the findings, that we couldn't say that. But you need to make it very clear that it's not that the evidence says that woodlands don't work, it's that we don't have existing evidence. So that type of thing can identify a knowledge gap, for example. You may also need to be careful about how you word things for policy outputs. So I've already mentioned it through much of the other potential problems, but communication is key. You've got different types of communication going on, formal communication. When are your interim reports going to be, for example? But there may well be lots of informal communication as well. And it's very useful for there to be a contact that can act as the go-to person within the policy organisation and within the systematic review team, so that you've generally got the same people speaking to each other. So who is your main point of contact? And how would they like to be contacted? What suits both of you? Of course, communicating your project at the end is also really important, and communication for policy might be different than communication for an academic audience, or you might need a number of different methods of communication. So for the review, which I've touched on a few times, I think we had a 90-page report. So here's some of the pages out of that report. Obviously, most of your policy people aren't going to read that. It's quite important to have the detail there, but most of them aren't going to read it. So what other communication methods might you use? Well, typically you'll have a concise summary paper that may be, depending on the size of your review, maybe between 2 and 10 pages long, perhaps. And that highlights the findings rather than the methods used. Most of the policy decision makers are interested in what you've found. Of course, you need to give a little bit of background and link to methods used. What do you say in that? Well, you might provide implications for policy and recommendations for further research, so where there's research gaps, or for further synthesis, but you need to be really careful not to actually provide recommendations for policymakers. It's down to the policy organisations to make the recommendations on policy themselves. You provide the evidence that they use in order to do that. Other forms of dissemination, you might want to have scientific publications. And at the bottom there, we've got a scientific publication that was produced on that particular review that I've been talking about. You might have systematic review libraries, you might have websites, you might have other policy briefs. At the top there, there's a one-page policy note that was used. Technical press, infographics, all sorts. But again, you don't necessarily have to do all of those yourself. Work with the policymaker, decide who's going to do what. Do you provide the information and they put graphics on things and make it look nice, or do you need to do that as well? And then the final problem that we identified was the fact that policy decisions are often quite slow, and it's not always apparent how reviews are used. Researchers often like to be able to show impact and, you know, are judged on impact as well as on the work that they carry out. So, but again, this comes down to that common understanding really, and recognition that policy doesn't always result in legislation or regulation, and work might be longer or more formative. So again, perhaps try and keep that communication going a bit longer. Give them a call in a few months and just ask them how they might have used your review that you've carried out. And finally, I've just got a few tips. So don't underestimate the time taken for any review. If you're bidding for work with a policy organisation, or you're asked to do work, really think about how long it's going to take, because if you charge a lot less than the work actually costs you, you've still got to get it done. Important decisions could be made on that. So it's really important not to underestimate the time it takes. And to help with that, carry out a scoping search. So if you're bidding to policy organisations, or if you're, you know, providing them with a costing, carry out those searches first to give you an idea of how much research there is. Keep in regular contact. It's much easier to pick up the phone and then get a few weeks down the line and find that you've got deeper and deeper into a problem. And knowledge brokers can be really useful. So, so as I say, Debbie Coughlin, who worked on this paper with us, that was actually her job really. She worked as a go-between between the policy people and the scientists. And that's really useful, having that person in place if there is somebody. Make sure that everybody's in agreement on meaning of terms, etc. Consider what sort of outputs you might have and how they might be tailored. And be aware that the policy needs don't always match academic requirements. What you need to publish for policy might be different. Some of the things, the way in which your work might be used will be different. So be careful about what you say and how you say it. And do prepare for an undesirable outcome. Knowledge gaps or controversial findings could be really unpopular, so you need to be upfront that that might happen. And as I've said, this is just an example of how policy needs don't always match academic requirements. For a systematic map, we wouldn't normally really show what the findings are, but for policy, that might be one reason why they've incorporated that systematic map. So you can give them the information, then they might put it together themselves and be able to show some information which shows how well different things might help with their policy decisions. And finally, build those relationships. If you work well on a policy-related review, they may well want to work with you again. Like all of us, building relationships can be really important. Listen to what the Commissioner wants, but do advise them where you think there might be issues, and be upfront if you think some of the things they want aren't feasible. And finally, enjoy working with policy organisations. I work a lot with policy organisations and I really do enjoy it. Hopefully, some of the findings you have will actually have a real influence on future decisions. Okay, thank you very much. So I think we can open up for questions or discussion now.
Thank you, Nicola, very much for the very interesting section you just gave. It was definitely very informative, and yes, we can start now by taking questions. As I mentioned earlier, you can either type in your question in the question tab on the right, or you can press the raise your hand button and we can unmute you and you can ask your question verbally.
Okay, so I think we've got a stunned silence. Has anybody thinking of working with policymakers that might want to ask anything specific or anything on any of the examples?
We have a question from Tara O'Neill. She says, thank you for the informative talk. Please, could you explain what a systematic map is?
Yeah, sure. And apologies for that. I should have done that really. So the difference between a systematic review and a systematic map is that a systematic review generally aims to actually answer a question. So for example, that question might be, how effective are, using the example that we had before, how effective are buffer strips at reducing nitrate pollution in watercourses? So there's a very clear question there. In that case, looking at the effectiveness of something. Questions can, of course, be formulated slightly differently. A systematic map doesn't necessarily aim to answer a question. What a systematic map does is it aims to tell you what type of research there is and where the gaps are in the research. So, for example, the reason with that review that I was talking about, where it had 25 sub-questions, we carried out a systematic map instead of a systematic review, was that it was very disparate set of questions, very difficult to be able to say, does one, through using a systematic review process, does one work? But what we could do was see where there was already lots of research and where the research gaps were. And we actually also found some existing meta-analyses that showed how some of the interventions worked.
Thank you.
Okay,
we have another question from Janine Yuimana. Is a systematic map similar to a scoping review? When should the systematic map be used?
Okay, thanks, Janine. Hopefully I've answered some of that. Yes, in a way, in some fields, the systematic map or similar things might be called a scoping review. So often what you're doing with scoping is you're actually looking to see how much research is there in order to then carry out a full review, where a systematic map produces an output in itself. And what a systematic map would usually produce is a database of research, which is usually searchable, together with a number of visualizations of what sort of research is, what the patterns are in research, etc. So similar to a scoping review, but more developed and produces an output itself. And in actual fact, we, as I said, we do a lot of work with policy, and we actually carry out far more systematic maps than we do systematic reviews, because for policy questions, which often are diverse, they tend to often be more useful actually, and the policymakers can take the research, look at the gaps, and then take it and do other things with it.
Again, so much, Dr. Randall, for this great presentation. And as for the attendees who are with us today, just make sure to follow us for other sessions of the GACI webinar series. And if you have any questions, please feel free to send us the question and we can directly send it to Nicola. And yeah, that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you.